week we started a new series entitled Messages of the Cross and the Tomb. And in doing so, we're looking at some messages that we are to take away from the fact that Jesus went to the cross, that he was buried in that tomb and then raised on the third day. And yet we're doing that without necessarily looking specifically at the scene of the cross or the tomb. Mainly, we're just focusing on what the results of that are. And so last week, we started with the message, you can be justified. The death of Jesus made it possible for us to experience justification in the sight of God. That is, going from a sinful state to being back to that restored state that is as if I had never sinned. That forgiven state, that being brought back to, well, as we looked at last week, being made righteous in the sight of God through our faith in Him. And as we saw in that lesson, all have sinned, and we can all be justified, but only those who respond will be justified. So while it's possible for everyone, not everyone is going to experience that. The fact is, we have all sinned. We've all ended up in a position of being out of peace with God. And that's the kind of the topic of our lesson this morning, is finding peace with God. Now, most of us probably don't think of ourselves as being at war with God. Even those outside of the church don't think of themselves as being at war with God necessarily. We don't necessarily think of ourselves as being His enemy. And we kind of hit a little bit on this in Bible class this morning, because there are a lot of people who profess a love for God and yet fall short in their obedience, who, whether it's teaching or through lack of study or whatever the cause, end up not in obedience to God. And we are warned in Scripture that if we get more concerned about the world, more in love with the world than we are with God, that's enmity with God. And so, a lot of times, we may find ourselves not at peace with God. But what exactly does not being at peace mean with God? What does that mean to us? And I joked in Bible class about always ending up back in the garden. I'm back in the garden again this morning. Genesis chapter 3, verses 16 through 19 is where we're going to read. But to set the stage for that, it is the scene where Adam and Eve are in the garden, and Satan comes and finds Eve, and Adam's they're pretty close by, apparently, because she doesn't have to go far to give it to him. And Satan convinces them to eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Now, they were at peace with God. They were in a right relationship with God prior to that moment. But because they took their eyes off of God in obedience to what He had told them, they arrived at this state of being an enemy of God. And there are consequences to that. So Genesis chapter 3, beginning with verse 16, God begins telling them, here's what the consequences are going to be. To the woman He said, I will make your pains in childbearing very severe. With painful labor you will give birth to children. Your desire will be for your husband, and he will rule over you. to Adam, he said, because you listened to your wife and ate fruit from the tree about which I commanded you, you must not eat from it. Cursed is the ground because of you. Through painful toil you will eat from it all the days of your life. It will produce thorns and thistles for you, and you will eat the plants of the field. By the sweat of your brow you will eat your food until you return to the ground, since from it you were taken, for dust you are, and to dust you will return. Being out of peace, being enemies of God, always brings consequences in our lives. Now it's not always necessarily these physical things like it was for Adam and Eve, and these were things that were not just specifically for Adam and Eve, but these were generational results, still felt today. And so in a physical world, there are going to be some of these consequences that are going to be long-lasting that are not necessarily removed just because we get back to peace with God. I want to make that understood from the beginning. But how we deal with those consequences after we get back to peace with God does change. It changes how we handle that, how we bear up under those consequences. And so that is part of what we are striving to get to today as we try to figure out what does it mean to not be at peace with God. Today, it takes on all sorts of forms. We face struggles in life of physical aspects that may be the result of choices or struggles that come about because of how we have chose not to obey God. It may be matters of health. It may be matters of mind, of mental status. It may be affected in our relationships. The list goes on and on and on about all the different ways that it can manifest itself in our lives. Because our lives, our bodies, our cells, the totality of us, were created to be centered around God. Think about that. We are to be centered around God. He's our focus. He is our source of light, our source of guidance, our source of hope, our source of salvation. He is our source of love, our source of forgiveness. Every aspect of life, every blessing comes from Him. He is the center of everything that is supposed to be right and supposed to be good in our lives. We were created to worship and honor Him with Him as the central focus of our lives. But when we choose to move God to the side, even just a little bit, we begin to lose that balance. We begin to lose that focus. We begin to lose that which makes us what we were created to be. And the result is we begin to lose peace. We begin to lose strength. We begin to lose courage. We begin to lose faith. We begin to lose all sorts of things. Because God is the source of all of those. And when we get that source out of the center, out of its place of balance in our lives, it throws everything off. You think about a teeter-totter for a second. A teeter-totter works because it has a balance point, and everything teeters and tots on that one balance point. And if you move that balance point, doesn't teeter-totter so good, does it? Well, that's the way our lives are. If we move God out of the center that is our lives, everything else begins to get out of balance. Solomon in Ecclesiastes chapter 3 writes about the different times in our lives, and he says there's a proper place for all of them. Notice, and if you look at those first, 3, 4, 5 verses or so, he talks about all these different moments, and some of them we like those moments. We like moments to rejoice. We like moments to be happy. We don't like to think so much about the moments to cry, moments to die, the moments to fight. There's positives and negatives listed in all of those. Verse 10, Solomon says, I have seen the burden God has laid on the human race. He has made everything beautiful in its time. And my PowerPoint's not advancing. More that. I've seen the burden God has laid on the human race. He's made everything beautiful in its time. He has also set eternity in the human heart. Yet no one can fathom what has done from beginning to end. I know that there is nothing better for people than to be happy and to do good while they live. That each of them may eat and drink and find satisfaction in all their toil. This is the gift of God. I know that everything God does will endure forever. Nothing can be added to it. Nothing can be taken from it. God does it so that people will fear Him. Now, go back to my analogy for a moment of the teeter-totter. In essence, what Solomon is saying is there's a proper place for everything on that teeter-totter so that it balances our life out. Guess who's in charge of determining where the right place for those are? God. See, if I'm setting them on there, I'm going to be a little heavy on the side of good things happening. I don't want so many of those bad moments. But it takes some of those to balance things out. Sometimes it takes that to keep my humility balanced out. Sometimes it takes that to keep my submission to God balanced out. To keep my recognition, God, I need you. I can't do this on my own. Psalm says, everything has its moment, and when it's in God's positioning, it's a beautiful thing. Even a time to mourn. When it's something that is occurring in the life of Christians, can be a beautiful thing. Why? Because we know that person's gone home. When we know that person has left behind the struggle of this life and has gone to the beauties of heaven. The eternity in our hearts that Solomon speaks of has to do with our desire to be with God, to be like God, to experience life like it was in the garden, where we walk with God, we talk with God, we experience being in His presence, where He is the center, the focus of our life, and everything falls into place. The way that it will be when we get back to heaven for eternity. But that's why so often in life we feel like something is missing. Ever felt that way? There's a lot of people out there struggling because they know something's not right. They know something's missing, but they're not sure what it is. And the majority of the time, what's missing is God. We try to fill up that ache, that emptiness. We try to fill it up with a lot of different things. Usually we try a lot of things before we ever get back to putting what's supposed to be in that place, which is God. And usually the things that we do are hollow, they're cheap, they're often sinful copies of what God has designed. God created everything. He created it to be good. He created it to be in its proper place. But the world has jumbled it all up. The world has said sex in any form is good. Doesn't matter, doesn't have to be within the confines of marriage, doesn't have to be between a man and a woman. Just do it any old way. That is a cheap, sinful copy of what God created. It's out of balance. It's out of place. And because of that, it keeps everything else in life out of balance. And trying to add more of that supposed joy, more of that supposed happiness, will never bring it into balance. That's just one subject. We do it with other forms of relationship. We do it with houses, we do it with cars, we do it with, you name it, money, whatever. If we try replacing the ache that's within us with anything other than God, the balance is messed up. We have to start at that center point. Get God in the center. And allow Him to dictate how everything else works out in my life. And so we have to have peace with God. Romans chapter 5, verses 1 and 2. Paul writes, therefore, since we have been justified last week, when we reach this state of justification, through our faith, through what Jesus has done for us, we have peace with God through our Lord Jesus Christ, through whom we have gained access by faith into this grace in which we now stand. What grace did Paul and the Christians he's writing to, what grace were they standing in? It was the presence of God. It was the blessings of God. It was being a part of the kingdom of God. Paul says, and we boast in the hope of the glory of God. That's where we're trying to get to. That's what it means. We've got to go through this process of justification that we talked about last week, of getting made right with God through the blood of Christ, through our confession, through our obedience, through our baptism. So that now that I am justified by that faithful action, and God has purified me through the blood of Christ, I'm now back to being at peace with God. No longer an enemy. You see, the message of the cross is that God offered us a peace treaty. He doesn't want to be at war with us. He doesn't want to have to sentence us to hell. He doesn't want to have our lives out of balance. What he wants is for us to be centered on him and for our lives to be what he designed them and created them to be. We continue looking at Romans chapter 5, verse 6. Paul goes on there to say, you see, at just the right time, when we were still powerless, Christ died for the ungodly. Very rarely will anyone die for a righteous person, though for a good person, someone might possibly dare to die. But God demonstrates his love for us in this. While we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Since we have now been justified by his blood, how much more shall we be saved from God's wrath through him? For if while we were God's enemies, we were reconciled to him through the death of his son, how much more, having been reconciled, shall we be saved through his life? You see, the scene that Paul is laying out there is an unusual scene. Jesus talked about similar scenes. He talked about counting the cost, and he said, if you are a king and you look up and you see an army coming at you, you count the cost. Is that army so big that I can't beat it? If it is, Jesus says, you're going to send somebody out there and ask for terms. If you think you can beat that army, then you say, let them come on, I guess. God has reversed that scenario. God has looked, he has counted the cost, and he says, there is no way you can win. You don't have enough. I'm going to offer you peace. I don't want to fight you. I don't want to destroy you. So you don't have to sue me for peace. You don't have to come making these offers. I'm going to extend peace to you. And I'm going to do that by showing you I love you. I'm going to do that by sending my son to be the one to die so that you don't have to die in this battle. While I was still an enemy, God offered me peace. God said we can rebalance things. We can make your life right. We can justify you. We can bring you back to the righteousness that you were created to have. And I'm going to make that possible by Jesus going to the cross. And I'm going to show you the victory that it's not about ending in death, it is about ending in life. Because I'm not going to leave him in the tomb. If we are reconciled through his death, how much more are we saved by his life? The problem that we have is that too often we don't accept the terms of peace. Too often we still say, I don't know, God, I want to test the waters a little bit here. We'll never win that way. We can never find peace that way. But when we accept the terms that God has put in place, when we accept the peace that He offers, then the pieces of our lives begin to return to their proper place. We begin to straighten out relationships. When we get them back to their proper terms, or sometimes maybe even we end a relationship. Sometimes we start new ones because they're the proper thing. Begin to manage my money better because God teaches me how to be a steward of it. I don't know, the list is endless, isn't it? I begin to teach my children differently because God teaches me how to teach them. I take care of my elderly parents because God teaches me how to take care of them. I take care of the neighbor that I see on the street because God teaches me how to deal with that situation. All of the areas of life that get out of balance, that I can struggle with, that I find problems with, that bring me sadness, that bring me heartache, that bring me trouble, God can begin to put back in its proper place, its proper portion, so that not only am I at peace with God, I can be at peace with myself. And that's probably one of the biggest struggles that we have. When we lose peace with God, it usually results in losing peace with ourselves. Not happy with who I am. Not satisfied with where I am in life. Not content with the role that I am living out. That's because we find our value, we find our worthiness, we find our purpose, we find our goals when we're centered in God. There will still be those moments that, at least to the world, seem like negative moments. The one Solomon wrote about. But we'll see them now through the eyes and, more importantly, through the peace of God. That difference enables us to find beauty in the moment, to be able to find a way to rise above the message that Satan's trying to whisper in my ear. The way that Satan's trying to distort what God has told me, what God offers me. Be victorious. That was what allowed David to write the 23rd Psalm. The Lord is my shepherd. He's the center, the focus. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He anoints my head with oil. He's the one who makes my cup overflow. He's the one that even when I have to go through the valley of the shadow of death, allows me to do it with no fear. Because He's in His proper place. So message 2 of the cross and of the tomb. And because you can have peace with God, you can find peace in yourself and peace in your life. And so I guess the question this morning is that where you're at? Are things out of balance?
They're out of balance.
It starts by putting God back in the center.